Have you ever wondered if you're truly being paid what you're worth? What about in comparison to your other coworkers? Pay equity is a subject that seems to be shrouded in mystery and for some, a deeply uncomfortable subject to discuss. I'm your guest host, executive in residence, Marjorie Morrison. I'm stepping in for Anne while she's on vacation this week. And in this episode, we're answering the hard hitting questions around pay equity, exploring the real challenges that modern workforces face around it, and sharing valuable tips on how to approach those difficult conversations around fair comp with your manager in real world scenarios. We've brought in an expert to chat with us today on this topic, Nicole Armstrong. She's the founder and CEO of Ellequate, a solutions based firm that helps organizations build high performing cultures. Nicole also spoke at SHRM 2025 annual conference on this subject. I am actually so excited to have this conversation because I'm super curious about all of these things myself. So, Nicole, I'd love to just start out with some hard hitting questions. I want to get clarity on the topic how pay equity is not the same thing as pay equality. Can you help us explain the differences of those two?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. I think sometimes we interchange those terms and they're not quite the same thing. So, when we talk about pay equality, what we're really referring to is everyone with the same job, with the same title, earns the same pay. It sort of focuses more on the uniformity, the same title, same number, right? If you will. But when we talk about pay equity, it goes a lot deeper. It's really more about building systems that are consistently rewarding the value that a role brings to the organization, the skills and the responsibilities and the competencies that are required for those roles, regardless of who filled them. And this can help us really remove any bias and helps organizations pay for the work that's actually being done rather than any historical assumptions about the people doing the work.
God, that's a great way to differentiate that. And I didn't really realize that. So, are there misconceptions or like more obscure factors that make pay equity difficult to implement?
I think so. Well, I think it's important to note that there's not one cause of pay inequity. It's really a result of a multiple and interconnected factors. So, in some cases, when we're talking, for example, about the gender pay gap, in some cases, women are simply paid less than men for the same work. But we also, when we go a little bit deeper into the systems within an organization, we know that pay secrecy or practices like basing salaries on previous history allow inequities to follow employees from job to job. And so those inequities can compound over time. When we think about outside the workplace, right, we know that there's an unequal distribution of caregiving, unequal distribution of household labor. And so that actually might limit employees' ability to take on opportunities for advancement. And of course, in the US, lack of paid parental leave, high cost of childcare can force women into lower paying, more flexible roles or out of the workforce entirely. But I want to kind of tackle one of the biggest drivers of pay inequity that I think organizations struggle with and they don't quite know how to address. And that's what we call occupational segregation. Have you ever heard of that term before?
No.
Okay. So it's one of the biggest drivers of pay inequity. And there's two kinds. One is called vertical segregation. So that actually happens when men and women in the same field, one group is more likely to move into leadership than the other. So, for example, men might be more likely to move into leadership, women are concentrated in lower level positions. So, if we look at education, for example, over 74% of teachers are women, only 26% of superintendents are women, right? So that's what we call like vertical segregation. Horizontal segregation is a little bit different. This might be one that we feel relatively familiar with or instinctually know about. That's when certain professions are dominated, like certain folks are concentrated in different industries altogether. So we have like high paying professions like finance and tech that are still overwhelmingly male dominated. And then you've got lower paid sectors like caregiving and service roles, and those are still predominantly filled by women. And those patterns are reinforced by some of the assumptions we make about who's right for what jobs. But I want to kind of share a 50-year study that actually showed that even when women do enter those higher paid professions, those male dominated fields, if they enter in large numbers, the pay actually decreases. So the work doesn't change, but the pay decreases because there's more women in the field.
Ugh.
I know, right? And the reverse is also true. So when men go into female dominated fields in large numbers, the pay actually increases. And so,
Wow.
yes. And so, we often see programs aimed at getting more women and girls in STEM, but we rarely see more programs aimed at getting men and boys in early childhood education, right? And so, the challenge, I think, for organizations is that they're not really starting with a blank slate. They're actually trying to build fair pay systems inside a broader structure that was actually never designed to be fair in the first place. And so that's why achieving pay equity is really so challenging and why it requires really intentional systemic change because most of what we're basing our pay practices on are market value, and market value is reflecting the biases we have about who fills different positions.
Nicole, you just did such a nice job explaining that, and I have to say, you just like made my brain go wow. Like you helped me see that in a way that I had never thought about it. So I really appreciate it, and I appreciate that you spend your day working on this because sometimes it is just like turning the prism of how we think about something. There was SHRM earlier this year did a pulse survey and found that 61% of HR professionals said their organization conducted pay equity or audits to identify like possible pay differences between employees that are performing like similar work that could not be explained by job factors. So is that what you would say is driving the increased adoption of pay equity reviews among organizations? Are they thinking about it differently?
I think they're starting to, and that's what we saw even in this past annual SHRM conference. I think I had a lot of folks come up and say, I hadn't thought about it before, but it makes so much sense when you think about it in this way. But I actually think that there's a lot of different factors at play. I think first, regulation is catching up too. A lot more states are passing pay transparency laws. I think companies maybe are feeling pressure to stay compliant because it's not, some of these laws aren't just around salary ranges. They're actually pushing organizations to really take a hard look at their internal pay structures so that they can defend how decisions are made. But I also think that a lot of it is around shifting expectations. So we know in 2025, about half of employers cited compensation as one of their top concerns. Unfair pay is one of the top reasons employees leave. And employees are asking to understand how pay is determined, even when they're applying for jobs, right? So 80% of US workers said, I'd be more likely to apply for a job if I know what the pay range is, if the pay range is listed. And so I think all of those factors together are sort of becoming more urgent for employers to have answers to how they determine pay, right? And I will say, and maybe this is has always been the case, but something that we've heard a lot from employers recently is around sort of that market volatility. And so when we think about the pandemic, the market shifted quite a lot, and a lot of jobs, the quote unquote market value skyrocketed. So companies were raising pay really quickly to stay competitive. But then when the market cooled, some employers kind of were stuck with this tricky issue, right? Like if you hired people at the peak of that earning for that role, and then you hired folks later when that role wasn't considered as valuable, that creates frustration, risk, and in many cases like legal exposure. And because you can't fairly value the same job differently just because of the time you hired someone.
I would just say, like, based on your experiences, like with the business advantages, like such as ROI, which we talk about so much, have you observed organizations that prioritize pay equity over those that don't?
Oh, absolutely. I'd love to share a couple of examples of folks that we've worked with. One in manufacturing, one in the arts. Both saw clear advantages when it came to performance and retention. So I'll start with one. We worked with a manufacturing company that, as they were doing a deeper dive into their pay practices, they discovered something really surprising during their pay equity review. Even though they were paying above market rate, their lowest paid roles, which were mostly held by women and particularly women of color, they weren't earning enough to meet their basic needs. So they were actually relying on public assistance. And a small raise would have pushed them over the what we call like the benefits cliff, meaning they'd be worse off than they were before if they got that raise. And so this was sort of an eye opener because I think the assumption is that market is neutral, and it's actually not. And it doesn't imply a living wage. And so one of their core values as a company is sustainability. And so when the HR director went to the executive leader and said, hey, we've got some folks who are not making a living wage for our region. This doesn't feel in alignment with our strategic priorities or our values. He said, absolutely, it's not. Like, we need to raise that. And they now have a minimum living wage of $24 an hour. And so for them, it wasn't about compliance. It was more aligning their comp strategy with their strategic priorities and their mission and their vision for the future. But what was amazing is I had an opportunity to talk to some of the employees, and one person said, like, I am never leaving this company. I'm already looking for opportunities to train and grow within the company. And she has since moved up into a different position, which is amazing, right?
So good. Like, it's such a good way when you're having to think about that difference of it doesn't cost as much, but the impact is high.
Exactly. And who doesn't want loyal employees who want to stay there and grow with the organization and also tell their friends and their colleagues and the community what a great place this is to work, right? Another one, I would say, there was an arts organization we worked with, and they were really struggling. They didn't necessarily have a clear compensation philosophy. Something we work with organizations on is really getting clear on what your comp philosophy is and how that aligns with your strategic priorities and your mission and your vision. And so they really worked to get clarity around what that would look like. They also reimagined their pay bands based on the internal value of the roles, the skills associated with the roles. And so they made some minor adjustments there. They trained their managers on how to have conversations around pay, so that people understood not only what the comp philosophy was, but how pay was determined. And what was amazing is that within 2 years, they started off where only 59% of their employees understood how pay was determined. And within 2 years, that number rose to 82%,
Wow.
right? And then what was really amazing is, in addition to pay, you think about pay, it also includes promotions. It includes opportunities to grow within the organization. It's your full earning potential. And so they got really clear on how promotions are determined and what you need to achieve in order to move to different levels within the organization. And the belief that promotions were fair jumped by 36 percentage points in 2 years. And so this notion that it takes some time, it takes some money, it takes some investment to do the work, absolutely the ROI is worth it because you end up with a business strategy with retention and attracting talent, right? It really becomes a competitive advantage when you can get clear on your comp philosophy and how that translates into your pay practices.
That is great. Thank you so much for all of that. I want to switch now to some, like, I don't know, real scenarios. So let's like bring this concept to life. Like, let's take some scenarios from an employee's perspective and get your thoughts on how they can approach these conversations around fair pay. So let's just start with scenario one. An employee discovers that a colleague in a similar role, sorry, is earning more than them. What exact steps should they take to approach their manager about this?
So I think pay is often brought, right? People can be uncomfortable talking about pay and people have questions around pay. And I will even say, even in working with employers, one of the key areas that we see is oftentimes people don't understand how pay is determined. And when that happens, they often don't think it's fair. So I think if that's the case, if an employee is kind of suspecting that they might be earning less or not what they're worth or what their role is valued at in the organization, I think they need to start by gathering facts. So making sure that they're collecting their most recent job description, specific examples of their contributions, any added responsibilities they've taken on maybe in the past year. And so that actually kind of prepares the conversation to be focused around facts and not feelings. And so when approaching a manager, I think the key is to approach the conversation with curiosity rather than accusation. So you could say something like, I'd really love to better understand how pay is set for my role and what factors influence movement within the band. I'm really interested in growing within this company. Since Q2, I've taken on X and Y responsibilities. Can we talk about how that maps to our framework? And so the other thing I would say, it's important for employees to understand that oftentimes we're taking into consideration two different factors. So one is the role value. So what is the role valued in relation to the organization and its strategic priorities? Not necessarily the humans that fill the role, but the role itself, right? So that we're all starting from the same place. The second is, how does the organization reward individual attributes? So those are those like factors that employees bring to the role. So that could be tenure, it could be specialized certifications, additional credentials. So sometimes when we see somebody might be earning more than us, our assumption is that it's not fair. But it also could be that they have 2 additional certifications and they've been there 3 years longer and they serve on a committee, right? So we want to make sure that we have all of the facts and the details. And that's something we can ask our manager about and say, hey, can you really explain to me how pay is determined and what those formulas look like so I better understand?
That makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Can we go to another one? Ready for scenario 2?
Yeah, let's do it.
An employee suspects that factors such as gender, race, or age may be influencing pay decisions in their department. They want to raise the issue with HR or leadership, but they're concerned about potential repercussions or being labeled as a troublemaker. What immediate steps should they take to address this?
So, again, I think similar to the previous question, documentation is key, right? Making observations about why you think that. Are there certain instances or scenarios in which you saw that in action? Is it conversations you've had with colleagues? Do you understand and have the right sets of data? So, anything you can do to kind of document what you're experiencing or what you're observing is really important. I think you can also schedule a meeting with HR and frame your concern around consistency. So you could say something like, "Hey, I know that you've put a lot of work into developing our pay practices. I really want to make sure they're consistent across the organization. These are some of the things I've observed. Can we walk through the criteria that's used to determine pay for this role? I might lack a little clarity here." Um, if you have an ombudsman, or maybe there's not a lot of psychological safety in your organization and you just don't feel comfortable going to HR or senior leadership, you can always make an anonymous complaint. So if you have an ombudsman or a place to voice concerns within the organization that's anonymous, that's also another avenue that you can look at if you feel like, you know what, I'm just not sure. The other thing you might want to look into is the anti retaliation policy. So if you need to, you might want to talk to a trusted senior leader in the organization first, if you're not sure about going to HR, so that you have somebody, a representative who kind of understands where you're coming from, that can help you with navigate that conversation.
That is really helpful. And I take it you've seen a lot of this happen in real time with the work that you're doing. So it comes from a lot of experience. Um, Scenario number 3. After taking on additional responsibilities or receiving positive performance feedback, an employee believes they deserve a promotion or raise. They are uncertain how to present their case effectively. What would you suggest they do?
Oh, I love this. So I think if you're seeking a raise or a promotion, you always want to translate your contributions into the organization's language. So if the organization does have a compensation philosophy that outlines how promotion happens or how additional attributes are rewarded, you can refer back to that and make sure that you're documenting specific examples that demonstrate your contribution to the organization's success. You want to make sure you're always connecting that work to measurable outcomes. So, if the organization is really interested in rewarding revenue or innovation or growth or customer success, you can tie back your specific examples to what the organization said is a top priority. So, you could say something like, since this past January, I've expanded my role. You've asked me to take on these three things. In our past review, I got these great remarks. Which band or scope do you think best matches what I'm doing right now in my role? And then what do I need to do, or what steps do I need to take in order to move to the next level? And so it might be that there's multiple solutions the manager can offer. It could be a title change, could be an interim adjustment. It might be a clear growth plan to move you into the next position that you're aiming to achieve. But I think always tying your results back to the organization's priorities are going to be key, especially if you can tie it back to something that's been documented.
Thank you so much for that insight. I know that that's going to be so helpful for our audience. So now I want to switch it over to them, and I'd like to do an audience Q&A focused on some HR advice. So in a recent All Things Work newsletter, we asked our subscribers to submit their questions about pay equity. So to our audience tuning in today, be sure you've subscribed. You'll find the sign up link in our episode description. Your responses to our question of the week could be featured in upcoming episodes. So for this one, let's start with Candace from Phoenix. She asks, suppose you're reviewing annual compensation adjustments and notice a potential pay gap between two team members with similar roles and tenure. How would you handle this situation?
Oh, I love this question, Candace. This is such a good question. So, I think the first step is really to make sure you're comparing apples to apples. You want to make sure that both employees truly have the same role, level, responsibilities, and location, depending on if you have multiple locations. Sometimes what might look like a gap on the surface could be justified once you dig a little deeper and you find that that particular employee has an additional credential or something like that. But I think the most important thing is to take a step back and make sure that your organization has a clear framework for how compensation decisions are made. And I want to stress the importance of a compensation philosophy. And I know I've mentioned this before, but it truly is the North Star. And in speaking at the conference this past year, I asked the audience, how many of you have a comp philosophy? And maybe about half raised their hands. And when I asked how many of you, how many of you who do have a comp philosophy, if I asked your employees to explain it to me, how many could do that? And people laughed. If we don't have a roadmap, we don't know where we're going. And so the comp philosophy really answers the questions of what is our mission, what is our vision, what are our strategic priorities and goals over the next few years, what do we value, how do we get there, right? And it's so important to have answers to those questions. So compensation philosophy is one. Then I think you can move into defining what is the value of the roles within your organization. So have you done an assessment of the role value that you're looking at when you're looking at those two different employees? The first is, what is the role itself worth? What are the skills and competencies and attributes needed to succeed in that role? And how do they contribute to the success of the organization? And then what's the internal value, right? How important is this job on a day-to-day basis? One of my favorite questions to ask employers is, how many days could you operate without someone in this role? Because oftentimes it's a great way to unearth biases that we have around certain roles, because the market might devalue them, but they're critically important to our functioning. And so having a clear understanding of what is the role actually worth to the organization is so important to make sure we have the same baseline. Then you can start to say, how do we reward individual attributes? How do we reward tenure or performance or specialized credentials or whatever that might be? Once you have that groundwork, it makes it so much easier to take a look at your data and say, yeah, we do have clear gaps here, right? That these two roles, similar skills, similar responsibilities, both employees have been here around the same time. There's really no explanation for it. If that's the case, then you really need to correct it quickly and communicate clearly with employees, right? Explain the steps you took to assess the issue, outline how you're going to prevent similar gaps in the future, and then make sure that you're checking in on a regular basis, conducting those regular pay equity audits so that you can catch any discrepancies early. Because regardless of whether or not you know about them, you're responsible for them. So it's really important to get ahead of it, make sure you have a clear framework so that you can, when someone comes to you and asks you, you have a very clear answer for them.
That was fantastic. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I'm learning so much. I think what this is such an important, I mean, I love that you're kind of putting it out there and then you're going deeper for us. So I really appreciate it. So next is Camilla from California. A team member asks for clarification on how their salary was determined. How would you explain the process transparently while maintaining confidentiality for others? And maybe that's your pay philosophy.
Yeah, absolutely. If you have a pay philosophy, certainly share it with your employees. You can have two different versions. And we work with employers, we give them two different versions. You have one that's sort of for leadership, you can have one that's employee facing, little plain language, bulleted, so that people kind of get the answers to the questions they have. So, certainly, if you have a compensation philosophy, make sure people understand it. The other thing too is you can certainly share the formulas that you've created without sharing individual pay. So when we talk about what is a role worth versus how do we reward individual factors, that's really formulas, right? So you don't have to tell people what someone in their department makes similar compared to them, but you can explain, I can't share other salaries, but here's how we determine pay for the role. Here's where you fall today based on how long you've been here and the additional things that you bring to the role. Here's how we can help you move to the next level, right? So you don't necessarily have to disclose people's pay, but you do have to have an answer for how you're determining pay. And if you look inside and you say, you know what, we don't really have a clear way to explain that, it's okay. A lot of organizations are in different sort of places on their journey. Start now, right? Even a simple documented philosophy about how pay aligns with your organization's values, really powerful first step. So just Focus on bringing consistency, building trust. That's going to give you a much better foundation. You're going to feel so much better about having conversations with folks when they come to you about it if you have that in place.
Nicole, this was so helpful and it was such good information that gave our audience so many takeaways. Thank you so much for joining us. I know that we all learned a lot from you and we appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Marjorie. It's been such a pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
If you enjoyed our conversation today, be sure to subscribe wherever you enjoy your podcast so you never miss a new episode. Also, did you know All Things Work is more than a podcast? That's right, we're also a weekly newsletter that includes in-depth articles and the latest research from SHRM to keep you in the know. Just head to shrm.org/allthingswork to sign up. Plus, follow SHRM on social media to view the latest clips and join the conversation on game-changing topics that are redefining the world of work.
SHRM.